Restaurant millionaire James Morrison disguised himself as a homeless man to secretly monitor his historic Boston tavern. From the darkest corner, he watched a waitress with bandaged hands serve cruel customers. Then an arrogant businessman deliberately knocked her tray over, mocking her as she fell. As she picked up broken plates, the bandage slipped, revealing a gold butterfly bracelet. James's heart stopped. It was the exact bracelet he'd given his daughter Emma on her 16th birthday, the daughter who vanished without a trace 5 years ago. But this waitress had different eyes, different hair, a completely different face. Yet the way she tucked hair behind her ear, that gesture was Emma's. The bracelet was Emma's. Could his missing daughter be hiding in plain sight, transformed beyond recognition? James watched closer. Every movement confirmed impossible truth. His daughter was alive, working as a waitress, suffering under someone's control. Someone had surgically altered her face, drugged her, erased her identity. This is the story of how a father's love recognized his daughter even when everything about her had been changed. Stay watching. The truth is darker than you can imagine. What city are you watching this video from and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. Boston, the Old Harbor Tavern, a Tuesday in October that would change 3 lives forever. James Morrison, restaurant magnate with an empire worth $400 million, had disguised himself as a homeless man to secretly monitor his historic restaurant. Sitting in the darkest corner, he observed Sarah, 28 years old, serving with her right hand completely bandaged, her face marked by evident suffering. She tried to hide with forced smiles. When an arrogant customer deliberately knocked the tray over her, James saw something that froze his blood. From Sarah's wrist, under the bandage that had loosened, emerged a gold bracelet with a butterfly pendant. The same bracelet he had given his daughter Emma, who disappeared without a trace 5 years ago. But Sarah had green eyes, jet black hair, a different face. However, that way of moving, that gesture of placing her hair behind her ear, James trembled. His daughter was there, transformed, hidden in plain sight. And someone had reduced her to this. James Morrison had built his gastronomic empire from the foundations of a small bar in South Boston. At his age, he owned 52 restaurants distributed between Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. But the Old Harbor Tavern remained the crown jewel, the place where everything had begun 42 years ago alongside his wife Margaret, who died of a sudden heart attack when their only daughter Emma had just turned 18. The Old Harbor Tavern occupied a building from the 1800s in the heart of historic Boston, 2 streets from Faneuil Hall. Its exposed brick walls, dark wooden beams on the ceiling, and original colonial tilework created an atmosphere that transported diners to another era. James had resisted all millionaire offers to sell the place, all modernization proposals. That tavern was his connection with Margaret, with the times when they served tables together and dreamed of a future that had now materialized in solitude. That October afternoon, Boston suffered one of those autumn rains that turn the cobblestone streets of downtown into shining mirrors. James had spent 3 hours transforming himself in his penthouse in Back Bay. The characterization was meticulous. A disheveled gray wig, unkempt fake beard, clothes bought at a thrift store that smelled of dampness and abandonment, broken shoes that let water in. He had even applied makeup to simulate grime under his nails and the deep wrinkles of someone living on the street. It was a practice he had initiated 5 years ago, right after Emma's disappearance. At first, it was a form of escape, of losing himself in another character to not think about the void his daughter had left. Then it became a business tool. He visited his restaurants incognito to see how they really treated customers when the big boss wasn't present. He had fired 3 managers and promoted 5 waiters thanks to these undercover visits. He entered the Old Harbor Tavern dragging his feet, perfectly playing the role of the beggar, seeking refuge from the rain. The maitre d', a stiff man named Jonathan, whom James had inherited from the previous owner, looked at him with evident disgust and tried to throw him out. James mumbled something about having money for soup, showing some crumpled dollars. Jonathan relegated him to the corner table next to the kitchen door, where cold drafts slipped in every time someone entered or left. The tavern was full like every Tuesday. It was New England clam chowder special day, a recipe Margaret had perfected, and they continued preparing exactly the same 20 years after her death. The aroma of clams, bacon, and potatoes saturated the atmosphere, mixing with the murmur of conversations and the clinking of silverware against china. That's when he saw her for the first time. Sarah Collins, according to the gold nameplate on her black apron, emerged from the kitchen carrying an impossibly heavy tray with only one hand, the left, while the right remained wrapped in bandages that reached to mid-forearm. James immediately noticed it wasn't a professional medical bandage, but strips of cloth that seemed to have been applied hastily, with dried bloodstains seeping through the fabric. He watched her move between tables with an elegance that contradicted her evident pain. Every time someone accidentally brushed her right side, he saw the spasm of pain cross her face before being suppressed by a professional smile. He noticed how she rested the tray against her hip to compensate for the lack of balance, how her left-hand fingers had become stronger, more skillful out of necessity. Sarah had jet-black hair pulled back in a strict low bun according to the tavern's rules, but rebellious strands constantly escaped, and every time she placed them behind her ear, James felt a pang of recognition he couldn't explain. Her eyes were an intense emerald green, nothing like Emma's honey-brown eyes. Her nose was more aquiline, her cheekbones sharper, her lips thinner. And yet, the group of businessmen at the center table had already gone through 3 bottles of reserved Napa Valley Cabernet. They were 5 men in expensive suits with that characteristic arrogance of new money. The most corpulent, a guy about 50 years old with a double chin and gold rings on several fingers, kept making comments every time Sarah passed nearby. Comments about her body, about what he would do to her if he had the chance. Words that made the others laugh with cowardly complicity. James clenched his fists under the table. Even if Sarah wasn't who he suspected she was, no woman deserved that treatment. But there was something more. Something in the way she slightly diverted her trajectory to avoid passing too close to that table. In how her shoulders tensed every time the man spoke. It was fear. But a specific learned fear. The fear of someone who knows exactly what certain men are capable of. At 9:30, when the tavern reached its peak of activity, the incident occurred. Sarah approached the businessman's table with the second course. Filet mignon with bourbon sauce, house specialty. As she leaned to serve, professionally maintaining distance, the corpulent man executed his move with calculated precision. His arm shot upward, hitting the tray from below. The crash was spectacular. Fine porcelain plates shattering against antique floor tiles, dark sauce splashing the whitewashed walls, silver cutlery resonating like funeral bells. Sarah fell to her knees among the remains, her uniform soaked in sauce, porcelain fragments embedding in her palms as she tried to pick up the wreckage. The man burst into laughter. "Look how clumsy you are, girl. You'll never amount to anything in life. Though with that ass, I'm sure you'll find other ways to earn a living." The other businessmen laughed uncomfortably. Some diners looked away. Others murmured disapproval. But no one intervened. The maître de Jonathan appeared, and instead of defending his employee, began scolding her for the disaster, threatening to deduct it from her salary. It was at that moment, while Sarah bent down to pick up the largest pieces of porcelain, that it happened. The bandage on her wrist, loosened by the impact and the moisture from the sauce, slipped. And there it was, a white gold bracelet with a filigree butterfly, small diamonds forming the wings, a blue sapphire as the body. James knew every detail of that jewel, because he himself had designed it with the best jeweler on Newberry Street for Emma's 16th birthday. The world stopped. The sounds of the restaurant became distant, as if James were underwater. His heart began to pound so hard he feared others could hear it. The butterfly was unique, irreplaceable. On the back of the pendant, invisible from that distance but engraved in his memory, was the inscription, "To my butterfly may you fly free. Dad." But it wasn't just the bracelet. As Sarah stood up, she made that gesture James had seen thousands of times, bringing her hair behind her right ear with a specific circular movement, the pinky extended in a peculiar way. A tic Emma had since she was 3 years old, when Margaret taught her that princesses should always have their hair pulled back to clearly see their kingdoms. James studied every movement of Sarah during the next hour, cataloging evidence with a detective's precision. The way of tilting her head exactly 15 degrees to the left when listening to an order. The habit of touching her earlobe when nervous. The manner of walking slightly more supported on the left leg, a remnant from when Emma broke her right ankle at 12 playing basketball. But there were disturbing differences. Beyond the altered facial features, Sarah moved with a caution Emma never had. Her eyes constantly scanned the exits. She never completely turned her back to the main door. She always maintained a safety distance from male customers. They were the movements of someone who had learned to survive, not to live. James remained in the tavern until almost closing time, ordering dish after dish he barely touched, observing every detail. At 10:30, he saw Sarah pause to take a pill she discreetly pulled from her pocket. The way she closed her eyes when swallowing it, the visible relief that crossed her face, told him it wasn't a simple painkiller. The veteran waiter, Andrew, a man about 60 years old who had been at the tavern since the previous owner's time, approached to clear the untouched plates. James took the opportunity to play the chatty vagrant, the lonely homeless man who needs conversation. He discovered that Sarah had been working there for 3 years, always punctual, always efficient, but strangely reserved about her past. Andrew, lowering his voice like someone sharing a secret, mentioned that Sarah lived with her husband David in an apartment in Dorchester, but no one had ever seen him. The man supposedly picked her up every night, but always waited in a car with tinted windows. Once, Andrew had seen bruises on Sarah's neck, but when he asked, she said it had been a domestic accident. Around 11, the tavern began to empty. James headed to the bathroom, which required passing through the back hallway near the kitchen. He heard voices in the small interior courtyard the staff used for breaks. He peeked carefully from the shadows. Sarah was sitting on an overturned vegetable crate, trying to redo the bandage on her hand. In the light of the courtyard's single bulb, James could clearly see the wounds. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. Deep, precise cuts, some fresh, others in different stages of healing, forming a pattern that couldn't be accidental. Someone was systematically torturing her. But what froze his blood was what Sarah murmured while bandaging herself. It was a song, barely audible but unmistakable. Sleep, my child, sleep, my love. Sleep, piece of my heart. The lullaby Margaret sang to Emma, with the same personalized melody his wife had invented. That little trill at the end of each verse that only their family knew. James had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Tears ran down his face, mixing with the makeup that simulated dirt. His little girl, his butterfly, was alive, but captive, transformed into something unrecognizable, suffering horrors he couldn't imagine. A sound of footsteps alerted him. He hid in the shadows as the maître de Jonathan entered the courtyard. His attitude toward Sarah instantly changed from public severity to something more sinister. He approached too close to her, invading her personal space. Jonathan's words were like daggers. David called me. He says if your attitude doesn't improve, there will be consequences. You know what happened last time you resisted. Sarah visibly shrank, murmuring that she was sorry, that she would be better. Jonathan smiled cruelly and added, "You better. You don't want your father to find out what you've become, do you? The great James Morrison, discovering his perfect little daughter, is now a drug addict who sells herself for a fix." James almost surged from the shadows at that moment, but something stopped him. Jonathan was involved. How many more were? What networks kept his daughter prisoner? He needed more information before acting. During the following days, James mobilized resources he had accumulated in 40 years of business. His head of security, a former FBI agent named Michael Torres, began a discreet investigation. What they discovered was a horror beyond imaginable. David Collins, officially a business consultant, was actually a predator specialized in what experts called romantic captivity. His modus operandi was to identify young women from wealthy families, seduce them, isolate them, and then control them through a combination of drugs, violence, and psychological manipulation. The security cameras Torres installed near the Dorchester apartment revealed the daily routine of horror. David kept Sarah, Emma, in a state of constant chemical dependency, alternating sedatives with stimulants, creating a cycle of need only he could satisfy. The cuts on her hands were punishments for infractions: looking at a customer too long, smiling too much, speaking without permission. But the most devastating discovery came from medical records Torres obtained through contacts. Emma had been subjected to multiple plastic surgeries in the first 6 months after her disappearance. David had systematically altered her face, not enough to disfigure her, but enough to make her unrecognizable. There were falsified documents, a complete new identity, even a fraudulent marriage certificate. James discovered that David had met Emma at Margaret's funeral. He had introduced himself as a psychologist specializing in grief, offering free support. For months he had gained her trust, slowly isolating her from friends and family, convincing her that her father was too busy with his businesses to care about her. The night of the kidnapping had been meticulously planned. David had drugged Emma during dinner, taken her to a clandestine clinic where a corrupt surgeon had altered her face while she was unconscious. When she woke days later, David showed her falsified newspapers where James supposedly declared he wanted nothing to do with a drug-addicted daughter who had abandoned her family. James consulted with forensic psychologist, Dr. Elena Martinez, specialist in victims of cults and mind control. She explained that after 5 years, Emma probably suffered from severe Stockholm syndrome combined with chemical dependency. A sudden rescue could cause a psychotic collapse, or even lead her to suicide. The plan needed to be gradual and careful. James continued visiting the tavern each night, slowly establishing a connection with Sarah. He became the kind grandfather who left excessive tips, who always had a kind word, who never looked at her inappropriately. One night he managed to pass her a note while pretending to stumble. "You're not alone. Help is available. Don't lose hope." He saw Sarah's eyes fill with tears, how she quickly crumpled the paper and kept it against her heart. Torres discovered David had 2 previous victims. One had appeared dead from accidental overdose 2 years ago. The other remained missing. The pattern was clear. David kept his victims for about 5 years, extracting money from their families through them, then discarding them when they became problematic. Emma was approaching her expiration date. The opportunity came on a rainy Thursday. David had left Boston for a supposed business trip. James had confirmed through Torres he would be away at least 48 hours. It was his window of opportunity. That night, James arrived at the tavern without disguise for the first time in 5 years. The impact was immediate. Jonathan paled seeing the owner enter through the front door. Employees became nervous, whispering among themselves, but it was Sarah's reaction that broke James's heart. She looked at him and for an instant, a flash of pure recognition crossed her face. Her lips silently formed the word "Dad," before terror invaded her. She dropped the tray she was carrying and ran toward the back exit. James followed her, finding her in the courtyard, huddled in a corner, trembling violently. He knelt at a safe distance, not trying to touch her, and spoke with the softest voice he could muster. He spoke of the butterfly he had given her, how Margaret called her his little butterfly, the Sunday afternoons cooking paella together at the mountain house. Slowly, Emma's trembling diminished. She looked up and with a voice broken by 5 years of forced silence whispered, "Have you been looking for me?" James couldn't contain his tears. "Every day, every hour, every minute since you disappeared." The dam broke. Emma threw herself into his arms, sobbing 5 years of pain, fear, and hopelessness. Between tears, fragments of truth emerged. David had her threatened. If she tried to escape, he would publish intimate videos he had recorded while she was drugged. He had made her believe James would despise her if he knew what she had become. The extraction was executed with military precision. While James consoled Emma, Torres and his team entered the Dorchester apartment, securing all evidence. They found the arsenal of drugs, the videos, documents implicating Jonathan as an accomplice receiving payments to keep Emma under surveillance. Dr. Martinez was waiting at a private clinic with a complete detoxification team. The next 72 hours were a hell of physical withdrawal and emotional collapse. Emma alternated between moments of lucidity where she recognized her father and episodes where she called for David, begging forgiveness, promising to be good. James didn't leave her side for a moment. He sang her Margaret's lullaby, told her stories from her childhood, reminded her who she really was under the layers of trauma and conditioning. 6 months later, the Old Harbor Tavern celebrated a private dinner. There was no press, only family and close friends who had supported during the recovery process. In the center of the room, Emma Morrison, with her natural honey brown hair beginning to grow and her face slowly recovering its original features. After 3 reconstructive surgeries, served the first dish she had cooked since her return, her mother's, New England clam chowder. David Collins had been sentenced to 30 years in prison. During the trial, 2 other victims appeared to testify. Jonathan received 10 years as an accomplice. The tavern had been completely renovated, not in structure, but in soul. It now employed women survivors of violence, offering not only work, but psychological and legal support. Emma had decided to study psychology, wanting to transform her experience into a healing tool for others. The scars on her hands remained as a reminder, but she no longer hid them. They were part of her story, proof of her survival. During dinner, Emma stood to speak. Her voice was firm now, not the broken shadow from 6 months ago. She thanked her father for never giving up, for recognizing her even when she didn't recognize herself. She spoke about how evil can disguise itself as love, how control can seem like care, how isolation can be sold as protection. But above all, she spoke about resilience, about how a butterfly with broken wings can fly again if it finds the right garden to heal. The Old Harbor Tavern had become that garden, not only for her, but for all the women who now worked there, each with her own survival story. James watched his daughter with mixed pride and pain. He had recovered her, but both knew they would never recover the 5 lost years. However, they had gained something more valuable, the certainty that true love can see beyond any disguise. It can recognize the soul even when the body has been altered. It can rescue even when it seems impossible. On the tavern wall now hangs a discreet plaque. In this place, broken butterflies learn to fly again. And each night when the tavern closes, James and Emma share a glass of wine in silence. Father and daughter reunited. Survivors both of a nightmare that made them stronger. The last image that endures is Emma in the tavern kitchen, preparing the daily special with hands that no longer tremble. The scars are still there, but now they are lines of a survival story, not victimization. And on her wrist, the gold butterfly shines under the kitchen lights, no longer hidden, but proudly displayed, because butterflies are made to fly free, even if first they must escape the darkest cocoon. Give it a like if you believe a father's love can see beyond any mask. Comment with the moment that impacted you most. Share with someone who needs to know it's never too late to be rescued. Subscribe for more stories that demonstrate how truth always emerges, even when buried under layers of lies.